Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah alladhi anzala al-Qur'ana bi lughati al-Dhad wa arada li'ibadihi al-muttaqina ahsana al-murad. La mu'aqqiba li hukmihi wa la ruju'a li amrihi wa la li qada'ihi rad. والصلاة والسلام على خير الخلق وأشرف العباد سيدنا وسندنا وحبيبنا ومولانا محمد النبي الأمي الذي هو أفصح من نطق بالضاد وعلى آله وأهله وصحبه الذين اهتدوا إلى سبيل الرشاد والتابعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم المعاد. أما بعد، يقول الله تبارك وتعالى بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وجوه يومئذ ناظرة إلى ربها ناظرة. قال تعالى وما هو على الغيب بضنين بالضاد، وفي قراءة وما هو على الغيب بضنين بالضاء. This is a presentation on the issue of the pronunciation of the letter Dhad in the recitation of the Qur'an and tajwīd. This is an issue of ikhtilaf in tajwīd today among scholars of tajwīd and scholars of the recitation of the Qur'an. And there are two pronunciations that are transmitted today in the chains of transmission, in the Asanid. One is the more commonly heard one today, Dhad, and the second is Dhad. So the purpose of this presentation is to explain the reasons behind these two pronunciations, why there are two pronunciations, and which one is more correct according to the Usul of Tajwid, the principles of Tajwid laid out by the key figures of this science. Everything that I will present in this presentation is not my own discovery, but I have taken it from the scholars of the science of Tajwid and the recitation of the Qur'an. I have confirmed this pronunciation, Dhad, with teachers of Isnad, with legitimate scholars of Qur'an recitation, with chains of transmission back to the Prophet ﷺ. And I have learned both pronunciations, Dhad and Dhad, from various teachers. And the one that I consider to be more correct, and it is the one that I adopted later, it is not something that I started off with, but it is an opinion that I changed later on, is Dhad. I consider this pronunciation to be more correct, and I consider the pronunciation Dhad, which is what I used to do, to be the incorrect pronunciation of this letter. The first thing to establish is that these two are separate letters, and they are distinct both in appearance, in script, and in pronunciation, in articulation, and in manner of articulation. For some reason, people don't really see, there are some people that don't really seem to know how this letter is pronounced either. So just to clarify, this letter, al-dha, there's no ikhtilaf in this letter. There's no difference of opinion among scholars of tajweed and qira'at and scholars of the recitation of the Qur'an. This letter is pronounced dha. Adh, idh, udh, with the tip of the tongue or the blade of the tongue, and connecting with the upper central incisors, the two upper front teeth. The reason there's confusion today is that there are some dialects of Arabic, so some Arabs who are not well acquainted with Qur'an recitation, in the dialects of their Arabic, this letter has become dha as well. So they'll say things like Salatul Dhuhr and Abu Dhabi and things like that. So in the Qur'an, in terms of Qur'an recitation, there's no difference of opinion. This letter is dha, al-dha. This letter on the right, this is the letter of contention. This is pronounced by most people today as dad, ad-dad. Ub, ib, ub. And the other pronunciation, which is the pronunciation that I am advocating, is lad. And that is distinct from the one on the left. The one on the right, lad, is with the side of the tongue, either the right side or the left side, with the adjacent molars and premolars. So that is how you pronounce lad. And that is how it is different from the letter on the left, the place of articulation. So when I say Allah with a dal at the end, I'm referring to this letter. And if I say Allah with a hamza at the end, I'm referring to this letter. They sound very similar, but they are quite distinct in articulation. The first thing that we need to establish before we talk about the pronunciation of the letters is the Usul of Tajwid. What are the principles of Tajwid? So the question is that, this is a real life experience for me, that if I learned Lad from one teacher and I learned Lad from another teacher, how do I determine which one is correct? Are they both correct? Are neither correct? Is only one correct? And if so, which one? Similarly, there are other issues of contention in Tajweed today, other ikhtilafat. So something like ikhfa shafawi and iqlab. So a mim sakin or a noon sakin or tanween followed by a ba. So something like mim ba'du. Is it mim ba'du or is it mim ba'du with a gap in the lips? Right? So this is an issue of tajweed, and I've learned these two different applications from different teachers. So how do you determine which one is correct? And you will never find in the books of tajweed and in the classical books of tajweed, you will never find that the majority is an evidence for a correct pronunciation. In fact, the correct pronunciation, if we're talking about general Muslim population, the correct pronunciation has always been a minority thing, because only the masters of tajweed usually are able to pronounce something properly. So majority is not a factor when trying to determine the correct pronunciation. So we have received the Qur'an through an oral transmission and through a textual description transmission, right? One is talaqqi and one is tajweed theory. So talaqqi comes from the verse وَإِنَّكَ لَتُلَقَّى الْقُرْآنَ مِنْ لَدُنْ حَكِيمٍ عَلِيمٍ. That, O Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you have received this Qur'an, right? You have received. So talaqqi is receiving the oral transmission. But there is also tajweed. There is the science of tajweed, which is the linguistic theory of the recitation of the Qur'an, right? So the first thing to keep in mind is that talaqqi is a necessary condition for expertise in Qur'an recitation, but it is not a sufficient condition. What does that mean? It means that learning from a teacher who is giving you an oral transmission of the Qur'an, it is necessary. You need to do that in order to be considered an expert of Qur'an recitation. But just because you have studied with a teacher and you have learned from a teacher and you're able to imitate that teacher, it is not a sufficient condition. It is not sufficient to be called an expert just because you have talaqqi. You need something more than that. You need a proper understanding of tajweed theory. True expertise is a combination of talaqqi and linguistic theory, which is tajweed. In some books, you will find that they use the word qiyas to refer to this, meaning an understanding of the mechanisms of the linguistics of tajweed, right? So if you have a combination of both talaqqi and tajweed theory, then you will have the tools to be an expert in tajweed. This is the reason that the scholars found within our own Asanid, within our chains of transmission, wrote detailed books. We cannot say that this tradition is just oral transmission and nothing else, right? Because the people in our chains of transmission, in my chain of transmission, the scholars that wrote the books, right? If what I'm receiving, if in my oral transmission contradicts the descriptions in the texts written by the people found within my chain, right, then something is wrong, right? So you can actually refer to a treatise written by Qari Siddiq Falahi in Tarkeshwar in India and his students. I have actually translated this in English as well, so you can go to my Medium and find the translation, and the original is in Urdu. You can also find that. It's a very good article. It's a very good short treatise written by them in which they discuss why there's a need for books and why oral transmission is not sufficient to preserve the science, right? What do we do when two isnads, when two asanid differ with one another, right? This is the main issue now. That if I'm learning one thing from one teacher and another thing from another teacher, and they both have chains of transmission back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then what do I do? How do I determine what is correct? Okay, and who is mistaken? Because people can be mistaken, right? People can be mistaken. So for this, I want to take a very close and careful look at an excerpt from Qari Salim Ghaibi's Legacy of Tajwid al-Qira'at. This article can be found online. He wrote this article. It's not too long. It's a very good article. I highly recommend that all students of Tajweed go and read this article in its entirety. We're going to take a look at just the last portion of it. So Qari Salim says that he talks about talaqqi and qiyas and texts. So qiyas in this context means making an independent judgment with your knowledge of tajweed theory that is not made explicit in the books or from talaqqi, right? So this is qiyas in the sense of ijtihad. So he says if talaqqi clashes with qiyas, if your oral tradition, if your oral rendition is clashing with qiyas, meaning you have an independent opinion and a judgment and reasoning on how something should be pronounced, and you did not find this in your oral transmission, in the rendition that you received from your teacher, then your independent judgment will be invalid, and talaqqi will be given precedence over it, since it is the first source and reference with regards to recitation. So talaqqi comes before anything else. If the texts clash with qiyas, then texts also will be given precedence over qiyas, because one only resorts to qiyas if there are no clarifying texts or the texts are ambiguous. Okay, so far so good. Now, there should not, ideally, in an ideal world, there should not be a clash between texts and talaqqi, between the textual descriptions of letters and tajweed practices and talaqqi and what you're receiving from your teacher, since the text, in essence, is documentation of the oral transmission. However, there is a conflict between the two due to various reasons. So now he starts giving the reasons. The first is an inadequate understanding or qualification in these sciences. So perhaps someone who is transmitting the Qur'an, an oral rendition of the Qur'an, did not have a solid understanding of tajweed theory. And unfortunately, this is becoming more and more common these days, where people memorize the Jazariya and they memorize the Shatibiya, but they don't know anything about linguistics or linguistic theory, and they don't understand the content of the Jazariya. They've only memorized the different chapters and memorized the categories, but they don't actually know what's going on. And they are considered experts of the science because they have all the ijazat and the asanid, but they don't actually know what's going on. So this is an inadequate understanding or qualification in these sciences, right? Someone who is an expert needs to, if you want to be an expert, you have to master both talaqqi as well as the text, as well as the theory in the text. Your talaqqi will be governed by knowledge of the text. Now, this is not something that Qari Salim made up. These are the principles established by the scholars of the science, by the key figures of the science. So the first one, Makki ibn Abi Talib, rahimahullah. So if you're a serious student of tajweed, you need to know who this is. This is a key figure in the science, right? One of the main issues today is that a lot of people talk about tajweed and they give their opinions on tajweed and they don't even know who the key figures of the science are. when people talk about hadith, right? Would you take the opinion of someone who's talking about hadith but doesn't know who Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim are, right? Would you take the opinion of fiqh of someone who doesn't know who Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Malik, Imam Ahmad are, right? You wouldn't. So you need to know the key figures of the science in order to know how to investigate properly and do proper tahqiq of this science. So Makki ibn Abi Talib, rahimahullah, he says that al-Qurra'u yatafadaluna fil ilmi bit-tajwid, that the Qurra compete, or there are some Qurra that are better than others in the knowledge of tajweed, right? There are varying levels of expertise. There are some who only know it through its transmission, right? Riwayatan. There are those who know both its, they know it both through transmission as well as theory. They know it riwayatan wa qiyasan wa tamyizan. This person is the expert and intelligent one. He has a combination of the transmission as well as the theory. Then there are those who only know it sama'an wa taqlidan. They only know it through what they heard and they're just imitating that, but they don't actually know the theory. I'm hearing it from my teacher, but I don't actually know what's going on in the mouth and in the oral tract, right? فَذَلِكَ الْوَهْنُ الضَّعِيفُ. This person is feeble, is the feeble and weak one. He will doubt and include changes and errors into his recitation over time, since he has no basis to rely upon. إِذْ لَمْ يَبْنِ عَلَى أَصْلٍ. Right, and does not transmit with understanding. Transmission of the Qur'an with knowledge and understanding is better than talaqqi alone, and talaqqi is the transmission. Theory governs it and holds its understanding. If a teacher combines between talaqqi, understanding, and theory, then he surely is an expert, and it would be correct to study by him. Right, so this is what it takes for someone to be considered an expert. Right, Abu Amr ad-Dani says something very similar. You can pause and read this if you wish, but he says the same thing. That a person who only transmits just with sama'an wa taqlidan wa huwa al-ghabiy al-fahih, this is a foolish and weak one, right? This person is not to be trusted because they don't actually know what's going on. You need to have proper linguistic understanding of the linguistic theory of tajweed in order to transmit it properly. Otherwise, and we see this happen, things will be transmitted and corrupted over time. Okay. Another reason why we will find a clash between texts and talaqqi is because qiyas or ijtihad is being made when there is no need, as the texts are clear. So Qari Salim here, he refers to the issue of ikhfa shafawi or iqlab, whether there is a gap in the lips or not. So he says that this is a faulty qiyas, faulty ijtihad, because none of the texts mention a gap, right? Now, it's very important for someone to understand that when there is no mention of something, that is not ambiguity. That is clarity, right? Again, I'll repeat, when there is a lack of mention of something, of a practice, then that is not ambiguity, that is clarity, because the Qurra and the scholars of Tajweed were very meticulous and very precise in their descriptions of Tajweed practices and pronunciation. So if a description does not exist, and you would expect it to exist, such as a gap, which is a very, very distinct feature, then that is evidence that it is not true. Right? If none of the texts mention a gap, then the gap is not true, right? So, and then he says that there will be a clash between text and talaqqi because of blind following of scholars who are regarded as experts without doing due diligence in verifying their findings. So he gives the same example here that Sheikh Amr As-Sayyid Uthman rahimahullah, he is this innovation of the gap between the lips for ikhfa shafawi and iqlab, this is attributed to him. So there's no doubt he was an expert of his time in these fields. It is recorded that he gathered all the Qurra of Egypt and advised them to maintain the gap between the lips when applying ikhfa shafawi and iqlab, since it was the most logical. and most followed his logical reasoning until recent, and a lot of people still do. You'll hear it in the Haramain, you'll hear it among many reciters today. They recite like this, and people don't do proper tahqiq because most people are unaware of the Usul of Tajwid. They don't understand, and there's been such an emphasis on just oral transmission. People aren't even aware that there are issues of ikhtilaf in Tajweed, right? Issues of difference of opinion in Tajweed, and there are many. This presentation is just one of many, but it is a very important one. Moving forward, Qadi Salim says, thus one who has achieved both talaqqi and understanding of the theory from the text of these sciences is regarded as one who is adept and proficient. So once you gain a sanad and ijaza, and you have done talaqqi, you should continue to understand the theory held in the text as well. Read all of the key books, all of the core books of this science, right? And understand properly. Ask someone if you don't understand. Then he says, it is truly a sad state of affairs. This is important. It is truly a sad state of affairs when teachers or reciters are confronted with textual proof regarding errors in their recitation, and they stubbornly and proudly answer, هَكَذَا تَلَقَّيْتُ عَنْ شَيْخِي, this is how I grasped it from my sheikh, from my teacher. This answer alone indicates to their ignorance. So he says that it is not enough to say, it is not enough to justify an opinion of tajweed by just saying هَكَذَا تَلَقَّيْتُ عَنْ شَيْخِي. No, you need to have decisive textual proof, concrete textual proof, justifying a practice of tajweed. Okay, so this is extremely important. And this takes us back to the letters. So how do we determine the sound of a letter just from textual descriptions? How did they describe it, right? So this is how they described it, that every letter has two aspects, and students of Tajweed will already know this, but every letter has two aspects. One is that there is a makhraj, a place or point of articulation, okay? So there is a place in the mouth or in the vocal tract where the letter is being produced. That's the where. Where is it being produced? And the second part is, how is it being produced? That is the sifat, the manners of articulation, as they're called in English. How is it being produced from that particular location? So these two aspects, you need both of them to determine how a letter is pronounced. Okay, so for example, in English, T, D, and N all have the same point of articulation. In my dialect, at least, right? So T, D, and N have the same point of articulation in the dialect that I'm currently speaking. They differ in manner of articulation. So T is voiceless, D and N are voiced, N is nasalized, right? D and T are not nasalized. So this is how they are different. Similar in Arabic, Ta, Dal, and Ta, they all have the same point of articulation, same makhraj. They're all from the same place. It is the how they are pronounced. That is what differentiates them. So ta is voiceless, dal is voiced, right? Ta is velarized, it has isti'la and itbaq, so it is emphatic. Ta and dal are not. So this is how they are differentiated. So if we want to reconstruct the letter, this letter, Lad, from the descriptions of the text, first we have to know what the makhraj is. And so what I've done is I have just compiled many different descriptions, starting from Sibawayh, who's very early, and then Makki ibn Abi Talib, rahimahullah, Abu Amr al-Dani, another key figure in the science of tajweed, very important, Imam ibn al-Jazari, rahimahullah, and I've also taken the short definition provided by Sheikh Ayman Suwaid, hafidhahullah. So just to clarify, Sheikh Ayman Suwaid at this time does not agree with the pronunciation of Zad, for which I'm arguing, but the reason I'm adding his descriptions is to show that these descriptions are consistent and have remained consistent over time, right? That everyone agrees on these descriptions. I'm not cherry picking these descriptions, but rather everyone agrees upon these descriptions. So what is the makhraj of Zad? The makhraj, the point of articulation, Sibawayh dies in 180. He says, "Min bayni awwali hafat al-lisan wa ma yaliha min al-adras makhrajul lad." So from the beginning of the side of the tongue and the adjacent molars, right? From between the contact of those two is the point of articulation of lad. So the side of the tongue and the molars. No mention of the tip of the tongue. No mention of the two front teeth or anything like that as well, right? So the makhraj, the place from which the letter is produced, and the sound must originate there. That is the side of the tongue and the molars. Okay, that's from Al-Kitab. Makki ibn Abi Talib, rahimahullah, dies in 437. This is from Al-Ri'ayah. He says that the lad is pronounced from the beginning of the side of the tongue and the adjacent molars, and then he goes on to say that the pronunciation of lad resembles dha. Okay, we'll get to that part later, but same definition, same description. Abu Amr al-Dani dies a few years later. This is from his book At-Tahdid. So he says that the letter lad is from the beginning of the side of the tongue and the adjacent molars. Some people pronounce it from the right side, some people pronounce it from the left side. And pronouncing it from the right side is the same as pronouncing it from the left side and vice versa. Meaning the sound, regardless of which side you choose, the pronunciation will be the same from either side. Imam al-Jazari comes later, is a very important figure in the science of tajwid. And all of these people, Makki, Abu Amr al-Dani, Ibn al-Jazari, right? These are all found in the chains of transmission of anyone, any reciter today, who has a legitimate isnad back to the Prophet ﷺ, that will go through these figures, right? So Imam al-Jazari, rahimahullah, he says, وَمِنْ إِحْدَى حَافَتَيْهِ يَعْنِي اللِّسَانُ وَمَا يُحَاذِيهَا مِنَ الْأَضْرَاسِ. So from one of the sides of the tongue and the adjacent molars. And then he says from the left side is difficult, from the right side is even more difficult. I don't understand that in terms of physiology, but it seems to be a sentiment that becomes popular, that the left side is easier than the right side, so on and so forth. We don't need to get into that. Finally, Shaykh Ibn Suwaid, he says, this is his description from At-Tajwīd al-Musawwar, his book with diagrams. So he says this: the makhraj of lad is hafat al-lisan, the side of the tongue, with the adjacent molars, the upper molars, right? So that is implied for everyone else, but it's the upper molars, not the lower molars. Okay, so just to see the diagram, this is from Shaykh Ibn Suwaid's book. You have a diagram of the tongue. These are the parts of the tongue. So this is hafat al-lisan, right here, the side of the tongue. And it could be this side or that side. So this is muntaha al-hafa, adna al-hafa, aqsa al-hafa. So this entire thing is the side of the tongue. And where will it connect? Here are the upper teeth. So these are your upper two front teeth, the central incisors. Here's the lateral incisors. Here's the canine. Starting from the premolar all the way down. So this is the wisdom tooth. Not everyone has this. So not everyone has wisdom teeth. Some people have it and it's extracted later on. So if you have it, you use it. If you don't have it, you don't use it. You can't use it. But from the first premolar, second premolar, first molar, second molar, at least these 4 or 5 teeth, that is the makhraj of lad. So this green part will connect with these teeth, right? Now, the difference of opinion that I have with Shaykh Ibn Suwaid is I don't believe that the tip of the tongue is used at all for the letter lad. I don't believe there's any evidence in the text showing that the tip of the tongue is used in any capacity as a primary or secondary makhraj, and rather the teachers that I take from and also their teachers. So Qari Anis Ahmad Khan Sahib rahimahullah, he wrote in his book Fawaid Tajwīdiyya that the tip of the tongue should not be used, and in fact you should keep it away from the makhraj of ta and dal and ta, right? Keep it away from the makhraj of those things, keep it low, and that is how I pronounce lad. Anyways, so keeping in mind Shaykh Ibn Suwaid is of the opinion that it's pronounced lad, That's why he has this going on here. Okay, so we've completed one half of the letter, right? We know where it's pronounced from, the point of articulation, the place, the makhraj. How about how you pronounce it from that place? What are the manners of articulation, the sifat? So again, there are 6 agreed upon sifat, 6 agreed upon manners of articulation for lad, and there's a 7th that some add. So what are the 6? The first is jahr. Jahr, some people translate it as voiced. I like to be more precise and say it's non-aspirated to account for the lack of voicing in qaf and ta, but that's a discussion for another time. So here are all your letters of jahr. A, ba, ja, da, tha, ra, za, za, ta, dha, a, gha, qa, la, ma, na, wa, ya. So they're non-aspirated, meaning they're mostly all voiced, and there's no breathless, there's no voiceless breath. There's no voiceless breath coming out when pronouncing these letters, as opposed to these letters, which Imam al-Jazari ordered them as فَحَثَّهُ شَخْصٌ سَكَتْ. So fa, ha, tha, ha, shin, kha, sad, sin, kaf, ta. So the nature of these letters is there's aspiration. There's a voiceless breath. Af, ah, ath, right? Ak, at, right? Those are stops, but there's a voiceless breath that comes with them. The second is Rakhawa, which I've translated as fricative. And these are the letters of Rakhawa. Tha, ha, kha, dhal, zai, sin, shin, sad, lad, dha, ghain, fa, ha. The opposite is Shidda. That's a, ja, da, qa, ta, ba, ka, ta. And between them is a category known as Bayniyya. Lam, nun, ayn, mim, ra. La, na, ma, ra. And grammarians add waw and ya. I'll get to this part later. So this entire number 2, Rakhawa, Shidda, Bayniyya, I've dedicated slides to these because this is the most important manner of articulation that we will be discussing. So we'll come back to this. Number 3 is Istitala, which means is velarized or pharyngalized or uvularized. Or so different terms that you can use in less formal vernacular. You'll find people calling them full mouth letters or thick letters or heavy letters. I'm not a huge fan of those terms. You can read my article on rethinking tajwīd pedagogy in the English medium. It's on my medium. So these letters are kha, sad, lad, ghain, ta, qaf, khussa, dagtin, qidh, right? So these are all the letters where the back of the tongue is rising and you have a heavier velarized sound. Kha, sa, gha, ta, qa, so on. The other manner of articulation for lad is itbaq, which I've just translated as emphatic by means of center of the tongue, so rising towards the palate, right? So sad, lad, ta, and dha. Now, I must note here that itbaq, people make this mistake for some reason today. It does not mean that there is a complete seal or closure of sound. And I don't know why people seem to think this when sad and dha literally do not have a closure of sound. So lad having itbaq is not a proof for it being a lad, right? It's not a proof, and some people use this as proof these days. It's not a proof because itbaq does not necessarily mean a complete seal or closure of sound. It just means that the tongue is rising up towards that area. It's sealed for ta, and this is why Imam al-Jazari says ta has the heaviest, has the strongest itbaq. Dha has the weakest itbaq because that part of the tongue is lower, is the lowest for dha. And sad and lad, he says, are mutawassitatani in itbaq, right? They are in the middle. This is Imam al-Jazari, he says this in at-Tamheed. Now, the 5th manner is ismat. This is a morphological feature We don't need to get into this, but basically everything that's not fa, ra, mim, nun, lam, ba is considered asmat. So this is one of the 6 sifat of Lad. And finally, the last sifa, the last manner of articulation is Istitala. And this is very specific to just Lad. And this just means that the Lad has a slightly longer duration. It has a naturally longer duration due to its long makhraj. So the Lad has the longest dental makhraj, the longest makhraj with teeth, right? So it's at least four plus teeth. So because of that, it naturally has a longer duration than other letters. It doesn't mean you are making the duration of the letter longer. You should not be doing anything. You should just be trying to pronounce the letter properly. And if you do so, then naturally the letter will have a slightly longer duration, which not everyone will be able to pick up. Computers and software will be able to pick it up when you record. You'll pick it up. You'll see that there's a slightly longer duration because the sound is traveling across 4 teeth, right, as opposed to 2 teeth for dha, right? But it's not something that you are doing. But anyways, these are the 6 sifat of Lad. Some grammarians and some scholars of tajwid add a 7th, which is tafashi, but the dominant tajwid tradition today strictly assigns tafashi to only sheen. So we don't have to talk about that now, but you'll find that some grammarians before the dominant tradition of tajwid today also describe Lad with tafashi. So now, what we're going to do in a moment is we are going to justify the pronunciation Lad as more correct using Makharij and Sifat. But before I do that, I just want to point out, now that we know the Makhraj and we know the Sifat of Lad and how it's been described, and by the way, all of those things in the previous slide, there's no difference of opinion on both sides of the argument today. No difference of opinion in the description. No one who pronounces it as Lad can contest or challenge the descriptions that I gave before. They accept those descriptions, right? So now what I will do is point out the issues of the modern Lad in terms of Makhraj and Sifat, because it is not enough to critique a pronunciation and just say that it just doesn't sound right to me. That's very subjective, and that's not a proper critique. If you want to critique a pronunciation, if you want to say that a pronunciation is wrong or flawed, you have to do it in terms of Makhraj and Sifat. And that's what I will do right now for the modern Lad. So the Makhraj, the problem with the Makhraj is that the tongue is not extending in width enough to reach the edges of the molars properly. So what's happening is that it's not extending far enough to reach the edges of the molars, and instead it's just hitting the palate, the roof of the mouth, right before the molars instead. Lad. So modern proponents, the proponents of the modern Lad, they say, no, we are reaching the molars, we are using the molars, there is contact with the side of the tongue and the molars. And the response is that no, there actually isn't. Maybe it's touching it, but it's not relying upon it. And that's very key. There needs to be i'timad. There needs to be a reliance on the molars. That's what makhraj means. There needs to be a reliance on the molars. And that's where the sound should originate. But instead, what they're doing, and they don't even realize, is that they're relying on the palate, on the roof of the mouth, the wet part behind the molars, and not the teeth themselves. Now, interestingly, Imam Ibn al-Jazari, rahimahullah, he notices that people have started doing this during his time, right? During his time. And he describes it in At-Tamheed. He says, وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ لَا يُوصِلُهَا إِلَى مَخْرَجِهَا. That there are some people that do not pronounce the Lad properly, and instead what they are doing is they're not allowing the tongue to reach the makhraj fully. They're not allowing the tongue to reach the makhraj properly. بَلْ يُخْرِجُهَا دُونَهُ. They are pronouncing it from before it, from under it, right? From beneath it. مَمْزُوجَةً بِالطَّاءِ الْمُهْمَلَةِ. And the sound that they are producing is similar to a ta. So what are the features of a ta? A ta has shidda, which we will discuss shortly. A ta has shidda. It is not, the sound of the letter does not flow freely. So the dad is similar to a ta in that regard. If you say dad, it's similar to saying ta if you're voicing it a little more. And he said that this is how these people are pronouncing it. They're pronouncing it da, dad. لا يقدرون على غير ذلك. They are not able to do anything other than this. And then he says وهم أكثر المصريين وبعض أهل المغرب. And who is doing this? The majority of the Egyptians and some of the people of Maghrib. Right now, something interesting. If you decide to read about this issue more, and you read the text that I have read, you'll see that this modern dad, when the ikhtilaf starts occurring, when it begins, this modern dad is actually labeled ad-dad al-misriya, because it originates with the Egyptians. At least it originates within the tajwīd tradition, right? It was present in dialects, but it infiltrates the tajwīd tradition among Egyptians and scholars of Egypt. Okay, and so it's very interesting that Imam al-Jazari, he sees this happening in Egypt, right? And he attributes this pronunciation to the Egyptians. Okay, so the modern dad is essentially a voiced ta, i.e. an emphatic dal. So this is why another critique that if you read further after this presentation, the books that I will recommend for reading, you will see that the common critique of the modern dad is that it is nothing but an emphatic dal. It is a dal al-mufakham or al-mutbaq. So and so the proponents of the modern dad, they say that no, it is not an emphatic dal because we're not using the tip of the tongue, we're relying on the molars, right? We're using the side of the tongue. Even if you're not using the tip of the tongue, this is the sound that's being produced, the emphatic dal, dad. You're just doing it from somewhere else, but the sound, what concerns us is the sound, and you're using the palate, and you're creating a complete closure of sound, and this is the sound being produced, and you'll understand better why this is wrong when we get to Rakhāwa. Okay, and that's what we're about to do. So that's the issue with the Makhraj. And the issue with the Sifat is what I call the Rakhawa problem. So what is the Rakhawa problem? Well, the first thing before we go on to Rakhawa, we need a reminder. The descriptions of the Makharij and Sifat are not tawqifi. The descriptions that we have in tajwīd, these are not tawqifi. These are not something that were taught by the Prophet ﷺ explicitly. Right? The Qur'an and its recitation was taught by the Prophet ﷺ, and it was imitated properly, right? But the Prophet ﷺ did not teach that these are the letters of Rakhawa, these are the letters of Shidda, these are the letters of Hams, these are the letters of Jahr, and so on and so forth. No, these things were categorized later on. And why is this important? Why is this important? I mentioned this because no one is bound by Sharia to say that the Dad is a letter of Rakhawa. No one is bound by Sharia to say that the Qaf is a letter of Shidda, right? There's something about it that's tangible. It's not a mutashabihat, right? It's not something that, oh, that's the way it is and we just stick to it, right? Sami'na wa ata'na. No, there's something about it that can be perceived by everyone that makes it that is the reason that the scholars categorized it as such. And if they wanted to categorize it as anything else, they were free to do so. If someone felt that, no, I think the Dad is a letter of, not a letter of Rakhawa, and it should be in this category, or it should have its own category, they were under free reign to do that as they wished, right? So there is something very interesting going on when we're talking about Rakhawa. So let's talk about the Rakhawa problem. First, let's define the definition. Let's define Rakhawa. So what is the definition of Rakhawa? So this is something that I just typed out very quickly on my own. And it is that the sound of the letter flows out of the mouth through the Makhraj. So the sound of the letter of Rakhawa, right, whatever letter is in this category, it is such that the nature of this letter is that the sound flows out of the mouth and it flows specifically through the Makhraj with turbulent airflow, meaning there is some friction. There is some sort of pressure being generated and it's causing this friction in the mouth, right? So it's not flowing super freely, right? It's not just like, it's not like, but there is some sort of friction occurring. Okay. Now the definitions. So Sibawayh defines how does he define Rakhawa? He says that these are the letters of Rakhawa: al-ha, wal-ha, ghain, kha, shin, sad, lad. This is the letter of contention. Zai, sin, dha, tha, dhal, and fa. And then he, and this will be a common theme, they do what I call the sukoon test, right? The sukoon test. So it says if you put a sukoon on it, right? If you put a sukoon on it, if you make the letter sakin, if you say like sin, for example, قلت وذلك إذا قلت الطس. We'll skip this for now. So الطس وأشباه ذلك أجريت فيه الصوت إن شئت. أجريت فيه الصوت إن شئت. You will be able to make the sound of the letter flow, however, if you wish, and for as long as you wish, right? So if you do the sukoon test on ghain, and so on and so forth, you are able to, the sound of the letter flows out of the mouth as long as you wish, right? Why am I skipping this? Well, we'll see. Makki ibn Abi Talib, he says, the meaning of a letter of rikhwa is that حرف أنه حرف ضعف الاعتماد عليه في موضعه عند النطق به. So what does this mean? This means that, so this is the opposite of shidda, right? As we discussed earlier, and we'll define shidda in more detail as well in a upcoming slide. But he's saying that the reliance upon the makhraj is weakened slightly. So you have a makhraj of the letter, you have a place of articulation. The reliance upon that place of articulation is weakened slightly so that airstream is allowed to pass through the gap that is created, right? And that's what these letters are. فَجَرَى مَعَهُ الصَّوْتِ. So the sound flows with that letter. فهو أضعف من الشديد. It is weaker than shadid letters, which we'll see coming up. And then he gives an example. ألا ترى أنك تقول أس and أش. This is ألف لام التعريف. So أس and أش. فيجري النفس والصوت معهما. So with both of these, the sound, the breath, the air in your lungs and the sound of the letter is flowing with these letters. وَكَذَلِكَ أَخَوَاتُهُمَا بِخِلَافِ الشَّدِيدَةِ. And the same applies to all of the remaining letters of Rakhawa, without any exception, as opposed to Shadida, which we will see soon. Okay. Abu Amr al-Dani says the same thing. وَمَعْنَى الرِّخْ. The meaning of Rakhawa is أَنَّكَ إِذَا قُلْتَ الضَّشْ. And we'll skip this one for now. أَجْرَيْتَ فِيهِ الصَّوْتَ إِنْ شِئْتَ. You're able to make the sound of the letter flow for as long as you wish. Imam al-Jazari basically copy pastes Imam Makki's definition. So same thing. from الشديد, and then as and ash, same examples, same thing occurring. And then we have Sheikh Ibn Suwaid who says الرخاوة. What is الرخاوة? هي الجريان التام لصوت الحرف الرخوي عند مروره في المخرج. So he says that it is the complete flowing for the sound of a letter of Rakhawa as it passes in the makhraj, or it should be through the makhraj, But the reason he does in the makhraj is how they justified dad, their pronunciation of dad, which I will explain. But again, same theme, right? The sound of the letter flows through the makhraj, right? What is the definition of a fricative? So I translated Rakhawa as fricative earlier. So fricative in phonetics is a consonant sound such as F or V, produced by bringing the mouth into position to block the passage of the airstream. So you're bringing the mouth into position to block the passage of the airstream, but not making complete closure. So that is the key. Rakhawa is fricative is not making complete closure, and that's Rakhawa as well. So that the air moving through the mouth generates audible friction. In English linguistics, this is what they call turbulent airflow, right? Turbulent airflow. So you have friction. If you're saying F, you're creating friction through that tiny gap in between your two front teeth and your lower lip. Same with the V. V is just a voiced F, right? That's the only difference. Doesn't exist in Quranic Arabic. So fricatives can be produced in all of these places. So these are all the various makharij that you can have fricatives in. In addition to F and V, examples in English are S, Z, and the two TH sounds. So think like tha and this, like dhal, right? Tha and dhal in English, think and this. Okay. Compare that to the definition of Rakhawa. I think it's a match for match definition, right? It's just a complete match. Okay, so that's Rakhawa. The opposite of Rakhawa is Shidda. This is my definition of Shidda. Quick definition: the sound of the letter is trapped within the mouth, is unable to flow out of the mouth due to a closure of the makhraj. And I should have added here, until the release of that letter, until the release of that sound, right? So you need a release. But the nature of this letter is such that the sound of the letter is trapped within the mouth until that release, right? Rakhawa, you don't need a release. It's flowing throughout the duration of the pronunciation. But Shidda, it's trapped and you need a release. Okay, how does Sibawayh translate Shidda? These are the letters of Shidda. And what is Shidda? وَهُوَ الَّذِي يَمْنَعُ الصَّوْتَ أَنْ يَجْرِيَ فِيهِ and then so it is that which prevents the sound of the letter from flowing within it, right? وَهُوَ الْهَمْزَ وَالْقَافِ وَالْكَافِ وَالْجِيمِ وَالطَّاء وَالتَّاء وَالدَّالِ وَالْبَاء. وذلك لو, and then he does the sukun test. وذلك أنك لو قلت الحج ثم مددت صوتك لم يجري ذلك. And you try to elongate your voice. الحج, you will not be able to. The sound will not flow. You will not be able to elongate because the nature is such that it blocks the airstream. It blocks the airstream in your mouth until that release. And how does Makki translate it? Define it? So why is it called Shidda? لاشتداد الحرف في موضع خروجه حتى لا يخرج معه صوت. So its reliance. So remember, Rakhawa ضعف الاعتماد. So that the reliance on the makhraj was weakened. And here, for Shidda, the reliance on the makhraj is so strong that it completely blocks the airstream حتى لا يخرج معه صوت, until to the point that the sound of the letter does not come out with it. And then he does the sukun test. ألا ترى أنك تقول في الحرف الشديد ألف لام تعريف here أد فلا يجري النفس, and it should be والصوت also مع الجيم والدال, right? وكذلك أخواتهما. So same applies to all of the other letters of Shidda, that it blocks the sound in the mouth, right? Ad-Dani, he says, أنه حرف اشتد لزومه لموضعه. Again, reliance upon the makhraj is so strong حتى منع الصوت أن يجري معه, that it prevents the sound of the letter from flowing with it. Like saying أج حج فليس يجري في الجيم الصوت. So the sound of the Jim does not flow. Ibn al-Jazari, basically word for word almost, from Makki, and then Ayman Suwaid, الشدة هي انحباس جريان الصوت عند النطق بالحرف الشديد نتيجة غلق المخرج. He says, what is shidda? It is the blocking of the flowing of the sound of the letter while pronouncing a letter of shidda due to the closure of the makhraj, due to the closure of the makhraj, of the point of the articulation. Perfect definition, in my opinion. This is a complete match of what we call plosive or stop in English, right? A plosive in phonetics is a sound characterized by, there's a momentary blocking, which they call occlusion, of some part of the oral cavity. So you have three stages, which is the catch, which is the beginning of the blockage, right? Then the hold, and then the release, which is the opening of the air passage again. And that this release is a sifat. So for serious students of tajwid, you'll remember that qalqala is part of the sifat lazima. And why is it part of the sifat lazima? Right? Why is qalqala part of sifat lazima? Meaning it's there when it's mutaharrik and when it's sakin. Right? Dal is mutaharrik. When dal is mutaharrik, it still has qalqala. Why? Because that is the release. It always has a release. So if you take a look here at the letters of Shidda, all of the voice letters here, or all of the jahr letters here, excluding Hamza. So Qaf, Jim, Ta, Dal, and Ba, these are all letters of qalqala. That is the reason they have qalqala, because the sound of the letter is trapped, and you need to clarify what letter this is. There needs to be clarity. So you have qalqala, which is the release. Ad, at, aq, ab. Right? That's why they have qalqala. Hamza does not need qalqala because it is a glottal stop. It is the glottis closing, and because it is a mahtuf or jursi letter, which means that it doesn't need qalqala for it to be apparent. It is known on its own. Fa'wu, right? Fa'wu ma'wa. So you can hear that without need for qalqala. And kaf and ta don't have qalqala because they are not majhur. They are not voiced, they are aspirated, so the hams serves as the qalqala for kaf and ta. إذا الشمس كورت, right? That aspiration at the end, كورت. فعدلك, فعدلك, right? So that's the hams. That's why they don't have qalqala. They are shidda. They need some release, and the hams serves as their release, so that you hear exactly what letter it is. Right? If I just said إذا الشمس كورت, you don't know what letter that is. It's unclear. Kuwirat, fa'adalak, right? I need that release to clarify that this is a kuwirat. It's a ta. Fa'adalak, it's a kaf. Okay, so that's what a plosive is as well, that release. Okay, it differs from a fricative in that with a stop, with a plosive, the blocking is total rather than partial, right? As they described it here, لاشتداد الحرف في موضع خروجه اشتد لزومه لموضعه, right? So it's total rather than partial, which is fricative, which is Rakhawa ضعف الاعتماد عليه. And then it can include in different, it can occur at different Makharij. So B and P are types of stops, right? D and T are types of stops. And G and K are also types of stops, right? So stop for which there's no English letter is the glottal stop, which occurs in these accents, such as in the word bottle. So they'll say bottle, bottle, right? Or something like that. Bottle. That's a glottal stop. That's a hamza. In Arabic, the glottal stop has a separate mark in the script, which is a hamza, right? So that's why even in my dialect, if I say the word mountain or fountain in casual speech, it will be mountain, fountain. So that's a hamza, fountain. Something like a glottal stop happening. So this is a one-to-one match of the definition of Shidda. Now we have Bayniyya left. So if you were counting the letters, there are some letters that were left out. They're neither Rakhawa nor Shidda. So early grammarians, they describe this as they describe these letters as between Shidda and Rakhawa, or letters of Shidda that in which the sound flows as well, right? So you'll find these different descriptions. So by the time of Imam al-Jazari, rahimahullah, then they're known as Bayniyya or Tawassut, letters of Tawassut. And these are Lam, Nun, Ain, Mim, Ra, and then Waw and Ya, according to the grammarians. They're not included in the letters of Bayniyya for Ad-Dani and Ibn al-Jazari, rahimahumullah. Sibawayh does not have an explicit category, but he talks about these letters. After mentioning Shidda and Rakhawa, then he says there are some letters, Shadid, alladhi yajri fihi as-sawt. The letters of Shidda, in which the sound of the letter also flows in some way, and we'll explain that now. So Ad-Dani, he says that, look, Lam, Mim, Nun, Ra, and Ain, that Shadid alladhi yajri fihi as-sawt, they are Shidda, they block the sound, but the sound also flows somehow. So how does that happen? He says that it happens because the tongue, or whatever the articulator is, withdraws from there. And because of that, the gap is much bigger than the gap that you would have in fricatives. So you do not have turbulent airflow, right? So for example, the Ain, two articulators in the throat are coming together, Ain, right? But there's no turbulent airflow. Whereas Ha, same Makhraj, but because you're giving more breath, you have more friction, right? So in Ain, you don't really have that. The tongue is withdrawing, he says. I don't know how accurate of a description that is, but because you don't have that turbulence and that friction, so it's not a Rakhawa letter, but it's rather something in the middle, right? It's more of an approximate. Ra, so for Ra, right, it's not a complete closure because you have this trill. You have takrir, right? Or if you're doing it more, the inhiraf, right? So you do one tap and you take the tongue back. This is an issue of ikhtilaf in tajwīd as well. But anyways, it's not just a complete closure, but there's more going on. This is a trill or a tap, so it's a liquid, what we call in English. So it has elements of both in it, and that's why it's Bayniyya. It's in between. Lam, right? So Lam, what's happening in Lam? That you have this closure happening. You have a contact of the tongue with the alveolar ridge, and then, but the sound of the letter is still flowing, but it's not flowing through that makhraj. It's flowing out of the sides, right? Out of the sides. That's why it's a lateral. So that it's flowing from elsewhere, and the sound is escaping from elsewhere. And that's why it's also a liquid in English, and it's a lateral. Same with Nun and Mim, right? The makhraj, the mouth makhraj is something, but the sound is escaping from elsewhere. It's escaping from the nasal cavity, and that's why these are also known as Bayniyya. In English, this category is sonorants, which includes nasals, liquids, and glides. Continuing resonant sound, right? So these are more, scientific linguistic descriptions, but basically the sonorants are ya, wa, la, ra or ra, ma, na, and also sound, the ng sound. So this also occurs in tajwīd, by the way. I don't know if everyone listening will know, but some people know. So if you want to comment where you think this occurs in tajwīd, it also occurs. So what's the definition of a liquid? A liquid, basically L and R, rhotics and all L type sounds. So lam and ra are also included in here. Partial closure of the mouth, resulting in a resonant vowel-like consonant. Okay. Glide, what is a glide? So two articulators coming together, bringing one articulator in the vocal tract close to another without causing audible friction, right? So That's why ayn, I believe, would also count as a glide or an approximant here, right? Because two articulators coming close together, but it's not the audible friction that you have in like it's so they're coming close together and then they're getting further apart. So this includes ya and wa as well, like yes and war. And then nasals is very obvious. We don't need to go over that. Noon, meme, right? So that's a ghunna. Approximants, waw and ya are lean, and then ayn as well, but in a different sense, where it's bayna shadid wa rikh. And then liquids, lam and ra, this is your inhiraf. So this is also a pretty good match, I think, for Bayniyya, the Sonorants. Okay, so what have we established so far? If we have turbulent airflow out of the mouth, and it's the least restricted in the sense that the air is not being redirected, but the airflow is coming out through the makhraj, not being redirected like in Bayniyya. That's Rakhāwa, okay? And these are all the letters of Rakhāwa, okay? And then you have another category in the middle where you have some airflow, but sometimes it's coming out of the mouth, but there's no audible friction, or sometimes it's being redirected from elsewhere. Like for the lam, it's coming out of the sides. For the noon and meme, it's coming out of the nasal cavity, right? So this is Bayniyya. And these are the letters. And then absolutely no airflow, completely blocking all airflow, most restricted is Shidda, right? And these are the letters of Shidda. And you'll see the letters of qalqala here as well, in the middle. Now, where would you put the modern dad? Where would you put the modern dad? If I say ad, id, ud, right? They say the modern dad should not have qalqala. Okay, ad, id, ud, waladdallin, right? There's no way of avoiding that qalqala with the release of waladdallin, but we'll get to that later. But if I'm saying that, where would you put it? I would put it in Shidda. I would put it in Shidda, right? That's what it sounds like to me, a letter of Shidda. If I'm pronouncing it, if I'm doing the sukoon test on it, the sound is being blocked in the mouth because of this makhraj, right? Now the problem is, and this is what the Rakhawa problem is. What is the Rakhawa problem? Every single scholar of tajwīd in history has classified this letter as Rakhawa. Why? If it was dad, why would they classify it as Rakhawa? And that's the point. The point is that we have another oral transmission of the pronunciation of this letter, which is dad, and that clearly has Rakhawa. It does not suffer from the Rakhawa problem. Al, il, ul, okay? And it fulfills all of the other sifat that we mentioned. It has jahr, it has Rakhawa, it has Istitala and itbaq. Al, il, ul, la, li, lu, right? Istitala and itbaq are covered. It is a letter of ismat. And it has Istitala because I can literally feel the sound traveling across the molars. La, la. So that is the Istitala. It's a long makhraj. So and the makhraj is correct as well. I'm using the side of my tongue and I'm using the edges of my molars. So there is literally nothing wrong with it in terms of sifat and makharij. And the modern dad has many issues in terms of makhraj and sifat, right? So the one that resembles dha in sound, lad, al, il, ul, this is much closer to the textual descriptions, especially Rakhāwa. The modern dad does not have Rakhāwa, it has Shidda. Now, one of the issues that we come across is that today people justify their pronunciation of the modern dad and they say, no, actually it does have Rakhāwa. It does have Rakhāwa, just in a different sense. Now, I want to clarify first and foremost that I'm not saying that people who say this have malicious intent. The reason that they justify this faulty pronunciation is simply because the tradition of teaching tajwid is a very sacred tradition, and the relationship between a teacher of tajwid and the student is very intimate, where it's highly stressed that, you know, I'm teaching you what I learned from my teacher, who learned from their teacher, who learned from their teacher, right? But we always have to keep in mind that there is a potential for corruption if someone along the lines did not have a proper understanding of the theory, right? This is why I say, if someone tells me that, you know, so-and-so is an expert of tajweed, right? I don't consider someone an expert of tajweed simply due to the fact that they've memorized these texts and all of these things. I would test their knowledge, right? If I say, and this is a common test that I ask people, that the letter P does not exist in the Arabic of the Qur'an. The letter P does not exist. However, we can still define P in terms of Makharij and Sifat. So what is the Makhraj of the letter P, of the P sound? And what are the Sifat in terms of Jahr and Hams, in terms of Rakhawa and Shidda, in terms of Istitala and Istifal, in terms of Itbaq and Infitah, in terms of Idlaq and Ismat, in terms of all these other things, right? Qalqala, and so on and so forth. Describe the letter P. If someone is able to do that, then I will say, yes, you have a proper understanding of Sifat and Tajweed. If someone cannot do that, then I say you do not have expertise in Tajweed, you have expertise in memorization. That's what you have expertise in, but you don't have an expertise in Tajweed theory, right? So that is the issue that happens. Now, nowadays, these corruptions have entered the chains of transmission, and so people will do whatever they can to defend their teachers, right? And not actually do tahqiq of the pronunciations, but they'll do whatever they can, and it's noble. It's a noble intention, but it is very detrimental for the science itself, right? So these explanations that I'm about to give to you, these are the counter arguments that are used by the proponents of the modern law in order to justify their pronunciation with a good intention, but very, very feeble and weak counter arguments. And we'll go through them one by one. So they say that one of the first things that they say is that the Rakhawa of Dad is special and is different from the Rakhawa of the other letters of Rakhawa, right? So it's different. And they say that's not actually the sound has to flow out of the mouth through the Makhraj, but it's just that the sound is flowing within the mouth is sufficient. That you can hear something happening within the mouth and that sound is continuing within the mouth, that is sufficient for Rakhawa. And what they say is that it's pronounced Dad, Dad, Da, Di, Du. And they'll say the correct pronunciation is Wala Dalin, Wala Dalin, right? So this extra voicing, Wala Dalin, that is, according to them, that is sufficient for the Rakhawa. And my response to that is absolutely not. That is not Rakhawa. If we go back and look at the definitions of Rakhawa, that is not what Rakhawa means, right? They're very clear about that, and you can rewind this and go check out the definitions again. And why would it make sense for all of the letters of Rakhawa that the sound flows out of the mouth, and for this one is particularly special? And if the Rakhawa is special, then where's the description? Where's the evidence for that? Right? There is none. So is this actually continuous airflow? No, it's not. It's airflow in the mouth. So what is this? They say that this is the istitala, that this is you're lengthening the sound, and this is the voicing, extended voicing, and it leads to a special Rakhawa. So this is what they claim, right? Response: the extension or exaggeration of jahr, of voicing, is not istitala, right? This is not what istitala means. Okay. The other thing is all voiced letters have pre-voicing. So if you say ba and dal, if you say it very slowly, say it very, very slowly. Ba, da. Very slowly. Ba, da. You'll notice that your vocal cords activate before the release of the sound. All voiced letters have pre-voicing, especially voiced letters of Shidda, right? Plosives. It's all pre-voiced before the release, right? So this Istitala thing, the Lad is only a letter of Istitala because it has the longest dental Makhraj, 4 plus teeth, right? So that's why this is not Istitala, right? Istitala, I explained earlier already, it is a natural lengthening of the duration because of the long Makhraj. The sound is traveling across this Makhraj. It takes a slightly longer duration to do so. Extending the voice before ba and dal would not grant those letters Rakhawa nor Istitala. So if I say that, look, ba and dal also have pre-voicing. If I decided to say ba and dal, does that suddenly make the ba and dal Rakhawa? No, absolutely not. Does that give them Istitala? No, it doesn't. It just does not make any sense. This argument makes no sense. It does not solve the Rakhawa problem because the sound needs to flow out of the mouth through the Makhraj. And the modern law traps the sound in the mouth just like it does for ba and dal. Okay. There is no recorded relationship between Istitala and Rakhawa in any of the classical texts. Okay. So that is another very important thing. And this is, if you see some of the counter arguments for proponents of the modern law, they will make this claim that no, because of the Istitala, the Rakhawa is special, right? No, this is not found anywhere. And if such a thing was true, then we would find evidence of this. Moreover, if such a thing were true, then why would they put Dad in Rakhawa, right? There's absolutely no indication in any classical sources that the Rakhawa of Dad is special or different from the other Rikhwa letters in any way. You go back to the examples of Sibawayh and Abu Amr al-Dani, and they literally used as an example al-ghal, right? In qal, right? They use those as an example to show that these letters, that there's no exception. If Dad did have a special Rakhawa or a special type of flow, they could have easily made its own category. They could have mentioned it. They were very detailed descriptions, right? So there is a huge lack of evidence here, which is actually decisive evidence that this is not the case, right? And they were not talking about la, they were talking about la. The letter that they were talking about was lad. So this is very important. So no special Rakhawa for lad. It should have a free-flowing airstream, as long as you have air in the lungs. What they're saying today is that, oh, this flowing within the mouth, that's not what's happening. They're just filling the empty space in their mouth as much as possible, but eventually it gets blocked. Okay. And that blocking is Shidda. That is Shidda, right? That is Shidda. So now we have disproven that. Now, another thing that happens is that some people have begun to realize this problem, the Rakhawa problem. So, but they also don't want to give up the la pronunciation. So there are new techniques that start cropping up. And one is this. So for walad dallin, for example, actually, something just came to mind, which I want to mention before moving on, which is one of the other absurdities of this extension of voicing, or what they call istitala, right? This walad dallin, is that this only works when the dad is sakin or it's mushaddad, right? What do you do? How do you do this rakhawa that they call rakhawa, this dad and walad dallin, when it's mutaharrik? Do you hear them say faqad dhalla dhalalan mubina? No, they say faqad dhalla dhalalan mubina, right? And that is a clear shidda, right? They say فَقَدْ ضَلَّ ضَلَالًا. They're not saying فَقَدْ ضَلَّ ضَلَالًا. That would be making it mushaddad, right? So, so where is the proof that, you know, this Rakhāwa is only apparent in sakin and mushaddad, right? That's essentially what they're doing. They're saying وَلَا ضَالِّينَ, but what about maghdubi, right? Okay, so a lot of people that learned this lad, they've begun to they've gained awareness of this issue and they try to get around it. So one of the things that I've noticed, and I've heard this many times, and unfortunately I can't provide a recording in this presentation, though I do have a recording, but I recorded them privately without the consent of the reciter, so I can't share them. But I will recreate it, and you can tell me, or you can think for yourself and try to figure out what's going on. وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ الضاد, right? So that's continuous, right? And people tell me that I'm able to do this continuous. Al-Dad. It's not being blocked. And my response to them is, do it again while holding your nose shut. They are nasalizing it, right? And I'm going to pinch my nose now. Immediate stop. Meaning what? As soon as I pinch my nose, it stopped. Meaning what? I was releasing the sound from the nasal cavity, from the khayshum. And that's obviously wrong because only noon and mim are letters of ghunna. The dad is never been described as a letter of ghunna. So a lot of people do this to try to make the sound continuous, but they don't realize that what they're doing is nasalizing it. So that is clearly wrong. The last thing that I've heard, and it's also something that has been documented as well by Imam al-Jazari rahimahullah, dark L, which is the la mughalladha, la mufakhama, right? Such as the one in Ism Jalala, Allah, so this la. So the nature of the proper lad is such that if you're not doing it properly, Allah, 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 it's very easy to make it turn into Allah, 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 right? It's a very smooth transition into Allah. And that is wrong. That's, you're not reaching the makhraj properly. You're not reaching the molars properly. And instead you're creating a lam mughalladha, a full mouth or a dark L. So Imam al-Jazari, he actually notes this. He says, وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ يُخْرِجُهَا لَامًا مُفَخَّمًا, right? They pronounce it lad, lad, وَهُمْ الزَّيَالِعْ وَمَنْ ضَاهَهُمْ, right? So they are the zayali' and the people that imitate them or that are near them. So who are the zayali'? From the books of cities and things like that. This area here, south of Yemen, touching into Sudan, Eritrea, modern Djibouti, as well as Habsha, and then Somalia as well. Today, there's actually a city named Zayla somewhere here on the corner of Somalia, bordering Djibouti. But Zayala refers to south of Yemen and all of this area. Now, interestingly, even today, there are some languages where they pronounce it, the dad as this. They say Ramalan instead of Ramadan or Ramadan, they'll say Ramalan. Where do they get that from? They get that from here because, and that's, you'll hear that in the Tamil language, right, in South India, as well as the Malay language. Pardon me, I've slightly interrupted. So this area, from this area, you have merchants and traders going to South India. And that's why the Shafi'i fiqh is prevalent in South India. And some of them settle there. And then from there, from South India, they end up in Malaysia. And that's why you'll find the pronunciation Ramalan even there to this day. And it's less common with the youth now because of mass media, but the older generations especially, you'll hear them pronounce it Ramalan, and that's where it comes from. So, extra pre-voicing, we've disproven that. Nasalization is also incorrect. And of course, the lam mufakhama is also incorrect. So unless someone has another orifice in their mouth or a hole in their tongue or something like that, there's no other way to achieve a continuous airflow except for this. The sound escapes through what is between the tongue and the molars, resulting in a sound very similar to the. And this is the definition of a makhraj, right? The makhraj is where the sound originates from and escapes through, for letters of Rakhawa especially. So when you have contact between the tongue and the molars and you leave a slight gap for the sound to escape from, that results in a sound very similar to dha. Now, why does that result in a sound very similar to dha? Let's think about it. The lad and the dha are similar in physiology, meaning the type of makhraj for both of them is nearly the same anatomically. Let's look at what Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah says. And I took this from my article on the fuqaha, the jurists, and their fatwa on lad and dha. So he says that these two letters, lad and dha, are acoustically identical. في السمع شيء واحد. This is from مجموع الفتاوى. And he says وحس أحدهما من جنس حس الآخر. The sound of one is from the same type, same genre as the sound of the other. لتشابه المخرجين, because due to the similarity of the two articulation points. What does that mean? He's not saying that the two articulation points, he's not saying that they are close together. That's not what tashabuh means. It means in genre, in type, in jins, they are very similar. They resemble one another in type of makhraj, not proximity. Al-Bahuti also says something very similar, again from the same article. And of course, I took these references first from Qari Ubaydullah ibn Atta, his text is where I first discovered these. So he says, لا يصير أميا بهذا الإبدال. So this is regarding the issue of imama, who can lead another person in salah, right? And what nullifies salah, who has more right to imama of salah. So he's saying here that someone is not considered an ummi, which is literally means unlettered or inarticulate, right? But in the context of this mas'ala of leading salah, it's someone who is less qualified in recitation to lead another. So a person does not become an ummi, is not considered an ummi, if he is not able to differentiate between lad and dha. وَلَوْ عَلِمَ الْفَرْقَ بَيْنَهُمَا لَفْظًا وَمَعْنًا. Even if he knows the difference between the two letters, he knows that they should sound different, very slightly different, right, to the trained ear, and that the meaning also changes when you switch one for another. But despite this, even if he knows that that's the case and he's not able to do it, he still would not be considered an ummi. Why? لأن كل منهما or كلا منهما لأن كل منهما أي الضاد والضاء, because both of them من أطراف اللسان, they are from some edges of the tongue or some tip of the tongue, right? وبين الأسنان, and they are interdentals, they are between some teeth. It doesn't matter which ones right now, right? These descriptions apply to both. They are from some edge of the tongue. For the dha, it's the tip, the front tip blade of the tongue. And for the lad, it's the side of the tongue, but it's still the edge, right? It's still the edge of the side, right? And wabain al-asnan, and they are both interdentals. They're both touching the tips of some teeth. For the dha, it's the two front teeth. And for the lad, it's the tips of the molars. And for this reason, وَكَذَلِكَ مَخْرَجُ الصَّوْتِ وَاحِدٌ. And thus the origination of the sound is one type. So they understood very clearly that both of these letters are similar in physiology. It's very obvious that they're similar in physiology, and that's why the sound that results is the same. If we take a look, comparing them, so makhraj-wise, the zad side of the tongue and edge of the molars, right? A va tip of the tongue and the upper central incisors, they're both interdentals, meaning just like tha and dhal are interdentals, it's a letter with a slight lisp, and the lisp happens because you're using the tips of the teeth. So dha uses the tips of the two front teeth, and zad uses the tips of the molars and premolars. The difference: zad has a long makhraj, 4 plus teeth. Dha has a short makhraj of just 2 teeth. Sifat-wise, both of them have jahr, both have Rakhawa, both have Istitala, both have Itbaq, both have Ismat, and Zad has Istitala due to, as we discussed before, the long Makhraj. And this is why Imam al-Jazari rahimahullah says, وَالزَّادَ بِاسْتِطَالَةٍ وَمَخْرَجِ مَيِّزْ مِنَ الضَّاءِ وَالزَّادَ what? بِاسْتِطَالَةٍ وَمَخْرَجِ. That's it. That's the only difference. مَيِّزْ مِنَ الضَّاءِ. Differentiate it from the dha with istitala and the makhraj. The location is different, and the istitala, the length of the makhraj, is also different. Otherwise, these letters are pretty much identical, right? And this is why Makki ibn Abi Talib, rahimahullah, he says that if it were not for the istitala and if it were not for the differentiation of makhraj, the location, meaning the location, then these two letters would be identical. These two letters would be identical. The only thing that differentiates them is not the sound, not some very distinct sound. They sound very similar. The only thing that differentiates them is the location of the makhraj and the length of the makhraj. The zad and dha resemble each other in sound. How do we know this? Established by over 1,000 years of scholarship. I encourage everyone to do more reading. In every generation, scholars attest to the similarity of these two letters more than any other two letters. If you read تنبيه العباد إلى كيفية النطق بالضاد, you will see how many scholars throughout the generations attest to the similarity between these two letters. And that is proof that lad is lad and not dad. Because who today thinks that dad and dha sound fi sam'i shay'un wahid are similar in sound? Even a child can differentiate between dad and dha. Even a brand new Muslim that has never recited the Qur'an before can differentiate between dad and dha. If we're talking about dad and we say that it is as'abul huruf, it is the most difficult letter, and it's extremely difficult to distinguish from dha, as mentioned by countless mufassirun, as mentioned by countless scholars of tajwīd, as mentioned by countless grammarians and fuqaha as well, the jurists, more than I can count, more than anyone can count, right? Then we know that they're not talking about dad and dha, they're talking about zad and dha. Okay. Early grammarians wrote dictionaries of lad and dha minimal pairs. What is a minimal pair? A minimal pair is when you have, in Arabic especially, you have a root, right? 3 letters. The masdar is 3 letters, and they're identical except one is lad and one is dha, right? So very, very clear example from the Qur'an, dhan and dhan, right? Dhanin and dhanin. This is a minimal pair, right? But in early times, the grammarians would actually write dictionaries of words that just had these 2 letters. Imagine someone wrote a dictionary, but just of words that had the letter G in it, or the letter F in it, right? Or the letter Q in it, right? that's essentially what they did. They wrote dictionaries just with words with lad in it or la in it or both, right? Because they're so similar that people would confuse these words, and it got to the point where they started confusing between the words, and the grammarians felt it necessary to make sure that people knew that these letters were distinct because they sound so similar. Dr. Jonathan Brown has a good article on Zlad and Vlat minimal pairs. So if you look up his article, he has a paper on this. Out of all of the pairs of letters that are similar, so think about all the letter pairs that are similar, right? Sin and Slad, Va and Dhal, Qaf and Kaf, right? All of these letters, right? Sin and Tha for some people, Dhal and Za for some people. So no pair of letters has been emphasized more, has been highlighted more, and has been stressed as being so similar to one another more than Lad and Dha. Now again, think, if it was Lad and Dha, do you think Lad and Dha is more similar than Sin and Sad? No, but if it's Lad and Dha, then it makes sense, right? If you look at my paper or my article on my Medium about the fuqaha and the fatawa on Lad and Dha, you'll see that the jurists, the fuqaha, they gave rukhsa to pronounce Lad as the Dha only. So if someone was not able to pronounce the Lad, they would pronounce it, they were allowed to pronounce it as Dha, and only Dha, not any other letter, right? And sometimes some jurists would give rukhsa for other letters as well. If you can't pronounce Sad, you say Sin. But even the strictest of them would allow this pair, and they would not allow any other pair. They'd say, no, you have to learn the pronunciation of everything else, but particularly this pair. Imam Fakhruddin Razi, rahimahullah, he said that these two letters are so similar in sound that there's no taklif anymore. No one is mukallaf. No one is held responsible according to Sharia to differentiate between these two letters in their recitation. Tajwīd scholars also considered this pair so extremely similar that they encourage students to memorize all the words in which dha or lad occur in the Qur'an in order to distinguish between them. So Imam Ibn al-Jazari, rahimahullah, is a great example of this. One of the chapters for those who have studied the Jazariya is Bab al-Ladi wal-Dha, right? وَاللَّادَ بِاسْتِطَالَةٍ وَمَخْرَجِ ميز من الضاء وكلها تجي في الضعن ظل الظهر عظم الحفظ أيقظ وأنظر عظم ظهر اللفظ ظاهر لظى شواذ كظم ظن, and so on and so forth. So he brings every masdar, every root that's found in the Quran that has the letter dha in it, he brings it and he puts it in this poem, and the student has to memorize it. And why does he want this? So that the student knows which words have dha in it and which have lad in it. Why the paranoia? Why the paranoia? If not because these two letters sound so similar that someone, even an expert reciter, could get confused. Right? Even an expert reciter could get confused. Therefore, that's why he made them memorize all of the roots with dha in it in order to differentiate that with lad. Another clear example, and this is one that Maulana Rashid Ahmad al-Ludhianwi also, he highlights this example, وَمَا هُوَ عَلَى الْغَيْبِ بِالظَّنِينَ, right? This is Hafs, according to Hafs, with the lad, but according to other qira'at, like Abu Amr and others, بِالظَّنِينَ with a dha, right? This, we don't really find instances in the Qur'an, in the ikhtilaf among the qurra, where you have an entire letter shift that has nothing to do with dots, right? So sometimes a ta can become a ya, or ya can become a ta because of dots. A tha, or what is it? فَتَبَيَّنُوا فَتَثَبَّتُوا, right? So those are all dot things, right? But in this situation, and Maulana Rashid Ahmad al-Ludhianwi, rahimahullah, he mentions this. He says that the only time that such a drastic change is allowed, where you change from one letter to another in full form, is if those letters sound similar, if they resemble each other. So he gives the other example, اهدنا الصراط المستقيم with a sin instead of a sad, right? So he says sin and sad sound together and sound similar, and the lad and the dha also sound extremely similar, even more so actually, and that's why this ikhtilaf actually exists, and the meaning does change. بالظنين يعني ببخيل, right? And بظنين يعني from ظن, right? Okay, how does this change occur? How does this change occur? And by the way, if you want to look at more masail discussed by the Mufassirun, you can find it a lot under the discussion of this verse. Sometimes they'll discuss it under this verse, sometimes they'll discuss the issue under the last verse of Surah Al-Fatiha, but they will discuss, some Mufassirun will discuss the issue of Zad in their tafsir, such as Tafsir Ibn Kathir, right? So how does this change occur? Fortition is common in interdentals. What does that mean? Fortition means it's a linguistic feature, phonological feature. So when you have an interdental, like tha, dhal, and dha, for example, sometimes gradually in a particular dialect, what happens is that they pull the tongue back, right? So I have tha and dhal and dha, but it becomes tiring to say. And over time, people start pulling the tongue back. Tha becomes ta. Dhal becomes dal, and eventually becomes a dal. Dha eventually becomes a da sound, right? Which is the modern lad sound also, right? Consider these words, right? This, that, thin, thick, with, both, brother, right? So nowadays we have this, that, thin, thick, with, both, brother, right? So fortition happens in English as well with these interdentals, the tha and dhal, right? So in some dialects, some people, depending on, I usually switch back and forth, this, that, or this and that, thin and thick, or thin and thick, with, both, with, or both, brother, etc. Now, in some dialects, right, in some dialects, the interdentals become labials. They become shafawi, with the lips, right? So for example, in parts of the UK, brother, bruv, right? Bruv with a V, brava. Both in some dialects, not just in the UK, and in the US as well, and with, both, with, right? I'm with him, both of them, right? So they pronounce this as an F, and they pronounce this as a V, bruv. So this also happens in classical Arabic. So fum, right? In the Qur'an, it's fum, but you also have dialects where it's thum, right? Thum. So thum and fum, it's the same word, but it's just a matter of dialect, lugha. So so dialects of Arabic have already done this. This meaning fortition with other interdentals. Okay, so with tha, dhal, and dha. So we see that in modern dialects, thalatha has become talata. In some dialects, thalatha has become talata, right? It's fortition. Something like hadha or hadhihi or dha or the become da and di, right? In many dialects now. Da, di. Dhikr, dikr, right? You hear this all the time. Salatul dhuhr, something I mentioned earlier, Salatul dhuhr, according to the modern law, pronunciation dha. So Salatul dhuhr has become Salatul dhuhr for many people, right? Abu Dhabi becomes Abu Dhabi for many people, to the point where now even in English they say Abu Dhabi, right? When it was Abu Dhabi. So fortition is common with interdentals,
And this is exactly why it happens with the letter Lad as well. And it doesn't happen across all dialects, right? So other dialects of Arabic, both pre-modern and modern, assimilated the Lad with the Va. So they just made all of their Lad to become Va. And you find this in Yemen. Some dialects have, I've heard people from Lebanon, from other areas, from the Gulf. So for light, they don't say lo, they say lo. All of their lad is actually la today. And this is because instead of fortition, they just assimilated. They just merged their lad with the la, and it all became one letter. In South Indian languages, as I mentioned earlier, it enters as a la, so Ramalan. In Turkish and Persian, it enters as a Z sound, just like a la does. So remember, in Persian, and then from Persian to Urdu, they don't have emphatic. So they don't have istila or itbaq. Okay, and they also don't have, in Urdu especially, and modern Persian, there's no interdental. There's no tha or tha sound, right? So that's why tha and sad both become seen in Persian Urdu. Sad and tha both become seen in Persian Urdu because there's no isti'la or tabaq. So sad becomes seen, and there's no interdental. There's no tip of the tongue. So tha also becomes seen, right? Similarly, the dha. Dha is an emphatic dhal, right? Dhal becomes zai because no interdental. Dha loses both its interdental and its itbaq and isti'la, so it also becomes za in Urdu and Persian. Similarly, with lad, if the pronunciation was still lad early on, lad, then they lose the interdental and they lose the isti'la and itbaq. And that's why today in Persian and Urdu and Turkish, it's pronounced as a Z sound. This letter, zwad, they say, it doesn't just come out of nowhere. If the modern lad were to be adopted by Persian and Urdu and Turkish today, then it would surely have come as a dal sound, just like it does in English today. Today, in English, much later in history, it enters English when this law that had already come about. So that's why we transliterate it in English as a D, and we spell it Ramadan, right? And when you talk to converts and they say Ramadan, they don't say, wow, that's so hard to distinguish from the va sound. No, they hear D. That's what they're hearing, an emphatic D, an emphatic dal, right? So there's this weird cognitive dissonance and denial that, oh, our dad does not sound like a dal, but at the same time, they're saying beware of words like aduda and makhdud and mamdud, right? And then they're transliterating it as a D. So of course it resembles a dal, an emphatic dal. That's exactly what it is. And if the modern dad were the correct pronunciation and were the classical pronunciation, then surely it would have entered the Turkish and Persian Urdu languages as a dal sound, because they have dal. They're not incapable of pronouncing dal, but it enters as a Z sound because they lose the interdental and they lose the itbaq and isti'la, and that's why it enters as a Z sound, because it was a fricative and not a plosive like D. Now, someone might ask, if a gradual change does happen, wouldn't we expect to find recorded conflicts in history? Wouldn't we see something in historical records that, indicates that there was a conflict over time, something happened? And the answer is yes, absolutely we do. We have plenty of records of scholars contesting the modern Lat throughout history. Okay, and people, and a lot of this information I got from people who are advocating the other side, and they use this as proofs for themselves, when in reality it's proof for us to show that there was a conflict, there was a discussion, there were debates, and there was actually serious political stuff going on, that shows us that this matter did occur, and it happened pretty late. So Ibn Ghanim al-Maqdisi, rahimahullah, dies in 1006, and he wrote Bughyatul Murtad. So this is in Egypt, and he writes Bughyatul Murtad. He writes this in 985. Well, he's not in Egypt, but basically this, it ends up in Egypt, right? So he writes this in 985. He hears the Egyptian Lad, he hears the Egyptian Lad, and he writes against it, and he defends his pronunciation of Lad. Now, Sajiq Lizada, also known as Al-Mar'ashi, rahimahullah, dies in 1150 after Hijri. So he wrote Juhdul Muqil, and he also wrote Kayfiyat Ada al-Lad. I've transliterated it here as a D just out of convention, but I will not be pronouncing it like that. So Kayfiyat Ada al-Lad. And he writes these books defending the pronunciation as well. And he also benefited from Bughyatul Murtad. Now, in Egypt, Sajiq Lizada causes a commotion by writing these books. The scholars refute him. It becomes a big deal. Later on, in 1280 after Hijri, Suleiman Effendi al-Barwasi, he causes a commotion. Right, they get very upset. He revives these books and starts the discussion again. Okay, they get upset with him. Then 1293, just 13 years later, Muhammad Ali al-Usyuti in Egypt gets exiled. Okay, for this pronunciation. He defends this pronunciation. They imprison him. They tell him to repent. He refuses. They exile him. Muhammad al-Minyawi causes a commotion in 1317. Now, a lot of these stories end with, and then he repented and retracted his statement. He did tawbah, right? If we want to believe that to be true, we can. It's probably, if that even happened, they were probably just hiding it so that they wouldn't get in trouble and thrown into jail. Abdul Hamid Ali causes a commotion 1355 after Hijri. And all of this is happening in the Egyptian region, right? In Egypt, because Al-Azhar has politicized tajwīd by this point, and if you disagree with them, they'll throw you into jail. As contemporary as Sheikh Ibrahim as-Samannudi rahimahullah, right? He's Sheikh al-Qurra in Egypt, died very recently in 1429 rahimahullah. He taught Husari. He taught Mustafa Ismail, he taught Minshawi, Abdul Basit, Mashari, Sheikh Ayman Suwaid. They all benefited from him and learned from him. None of them took his Lad. He was a advocate for Lad. There are recordings of him giving lectures on this. But none of these people actually took his Lad from him. And he was one of the Sheikh al-Qurra in Egypt. Right, and very influential, wrote many texts. Everyone respected him. Look how many people studied with him. He also was, because he was kind of a lone man in Egypt with this pronunciation, not many supporters. He was unable to kind of enforce it even on his own students. So he would let it go sometimes. And none of these people took it from him. We also find fatwa from the Qurra of Mecca, Medina, and Egypt. So if you look at Tanbih al-Ibad, these are all there. Fatwa from the Qurra of Mecca and Medina and Egypt that contest the modern law. They challenge it and they deem it incorrect. They call it al-Law al-Misriyya. And some of these are pretty recent as well. So you take a look in Tanbih al-Ibad, look at these fatwa. They're signed off by the Qurra of Mecca, Medina, and Egypt. You even have a fatwa from Sheikh bin Baz, right, saying that this is al-Law al-Misriyya and it's incorrect. You have a recording of Sheikh al-Albani on YouTube. You can find it where he explains why this is al-Law al-Misriyya and the correct law is actually Lad. So there are many records of scholars contesting it. This is not a recent discovery. This is a very famous and old debate, but not too old, right? After Ibn al-Jazari. Okay. So from Egypt, then it spreads outward. And how does it spread? It spreads because of the first live broadcast on radio of the Qur'an is from Egypt. The first recordings on tape of the Qur'an are from Egypt. And these are highly regulated by Al-Azhar and by the Qurra of Egypt, making sure that all the pronunciations are done according. And this is not my theory. This is Sheikh Ayman Suwaid. He also says this when talking about the spread of the gap between the lips and ikhfa shafawi and iqlab, right? Others have also mentioned that a lot of the Egyptian tajwid practices spread across the world because they were the first to broadcast live Qur'an recitation, and their recordings were the first to be on tape, and they were distributed globally, and their voices, mashallah, are so beautiful, and they were experts of maqamat, that of course it became popular, right? But the tahqiq needed to be done, right? And that's why just even up until today in Pakistan, many of the people of Asanid, they have maintained this pronunciation, but nowadays the laity, they used to say lad, and now they say lad, because of the recordings in mass media and how much it has influenced people throughout the world. Even people who had isnad, but they did not have a proper understanding of the theory to be able to defend the correct pronunciation of lad. So reassessing the modern lad lacks Rakhawa and does not reach the actual Makhraj. Okay, it should sound extremely similar to la to the point of confusion, as many have said, but it does not. La, right? La. So if I say anqadha dhahrak, you can easily distinguish between these two sounds. Whereas Imam al-Jazari and others, rahimahumullah, they said that when those two letters come together, it will be extremely difficult, and you must exert an effort to make it clear, right? Anqadha dhahrak ya'allu dhalim, right? Making sure the makhraj of the first is different than the makhraj of the second. Even beginners in tajweed can differentiate between the modern lad and dha, right? One of the scholars that Qari Ubaydullah al-Afghani, rahimahullah, he quotes in his book, he says that even a child today, that how can these people say, they quote the Salaf and they say that lad, or this lad, is the hardest letter to pronounce, right? It is extremely similar to dha, as has been said by every generation of scholars. And yet a child can differentiate between lad and dha today, and they think that their lad is correct, right? And then he says, فَمَا لِهَؤُلَاءِ الْقَوْمِ لَا يَكَادُونَ يَفْقَهُونَ حَدِيثًا. How can you say all these contradicting things and then say that it's lad? It has to be lad, very similar to dha. The emphasis of making sure lad that does not have qalqala is entirely modern and never found in classical sources. So someone who's studied tajweed today with a scholar today, and they've learned this pronunciation, they'll often hear, make sure you don't do qalqala on the lad, right? Lillahi ma fis samawati wa ma fil ard, right? Even though someone is inclined to say ard, right? Someone would be inclined to say ard. فقد ماء تقاض. No, قاض. So much takalluf to not do a qalqala. Well, the inclination to do a qalqala, why would the inclination be there? Because the modern lad is now a shadid letter. And as we discussed earlier, voiced letters of shadid and jahr, means it has qalqala. So if the dad were truly dad, if that's what the original pronunciation was, then it would definitely have qalqala, right? There's nothing in the classical sources that says that, oh, make sure you don't do qalqala of dad, because some people fall into this trap. This was never even a problem, because no one has the inclination to do qalqala on al. Lillahi ma fis samawati wa ma fil ard. Right? You don't need a qalqala because the sound of the letter is already flowing out. So this whole idea, when they say, oh, make sure that you don't do the qalqala on dad, they're literally proving that their dad is not the correct pronunciation by just saying that. Okay. Emphasizing caution and differentiating between dad and dal is also modern, right? If you look at At-Tamheed by Imam Ibn al-Jazari, and you look at the section of Lad, right? All of his examples are with Lad and Dha or Lad and Dhal. He is never, and you'll never find any classical work on tajweed saying, watch out for Lad and Dal in the same word. And nowadays, I've seen this myself. They say, oh, make sure words like makhdud, mandud, aduda, you're differentiating between the Lad and the Dal. And then they say, oh, our Lad is not an emphatic Dal. But you're literally cautioning about these words. So it's a very interesting cognitive dissonance. In classical sources, Lad would be compared to Dha, Dhal, and Zai, the voice dental fricatives. So Lad is also a voice dental fricative, and so are Dha, Dhal, and Zai. The Lad which resemble Dha is supported by extant Asanid. So there are Asanid existing today that still pronounce it as Lad. Okay, many Qur'an with legitimate Asanid across the globe continue to pronounce this Lad. Okay, I myself visited the madrasa of Qari Muhammad Sharif Lahori, rahimahullah, and his sons. Qari Muhammad Sharif is the one who wrote Sabilur Rashad in Urdu, an excellent and comprehensive work on the defense of this pronunciation. He established a madrasa in Lahore. I went to that madrasa and I recited to his sons, and they verified this pronunciation. And I talked with them in length about their father's book. And the Panipati tradition in the subcontinent as well has preserved this pronunciation, and many others in the Arab world as well. So if you go on my Medium, I have one post where I have a compilation of different reciters and their recordings of the Lad, right? Both Arab and non-Arab. It doesn't matter. So you can refer to that article. The majority pronunciation is not an indication of the correct pronunciation, especially in an age of mass media, right? Majority was never, to begin with, it was never a point of consideration for tajwīd, right? It was not in the usul. After the usul were documented by the scholars of this tradition. And then today, especially in an age of mass media, where everyone's listening to different recordings, and we're listening to recordings from the Haram in Egypt and things like that, everyone's recitation is influenced by each other, right? So it's not an indication of correct pronunciation. Proper tahqiq, proper verification, investigation is to refer to scholarly works and analyze the evidence. Refer to this article on my Medium as well. So, and then refer to these books. Tanbih al-Ibad, this is the collection by Qari Muhammad Yahya Sharif al-Jazairi, Hafidhahullah, who is a very strong advocate for this. And within that work is the work of Qari Ubaidullah ibn Ata al-Afghani, rahimahullah. And he's the one also that in Sheikh Yasir Qadhi's video on the pronunciation of the letter Lad, he also references Qari Ubaidullah ibn Ata, who was a teacher in Masjid al-Nabawi at the time. Bughyatul Murtad, this is Ibn Ghanim al-Maqdisi's book. Kayfiyat Ada al-Lad and Juhd al-Muqil, these are both Sajqi Zada's books. I would refer, and these are all the Arabic ones. So I would suggest starting with Tanbih al-Ibad for those who know Arabic. I am merely a translator. I have done my best to translate some of these works, excerpts from these works, into English, because this information was not available in English before. So I've done my best to translate, but none of these are my theories. These are not my unique discoveries. I am not some sort of some sort of conspiracy theorist. I am merely a translator of greater scholars before me. In Urdu as well, Sabil al-Rashad, this is by Maulana Muhammad Sharif Lahori rahimahullah, whom I mentioned earlier. Al-Irshad ila Makhraj al-Lad and Raf'at al-Lad an Ahkam al-Lad. These are from the books Ahsan al-Fatawa. These are treatises found in the books Ahsan al-Fatawa and Jawahir al-Fiqh by Maulana Rashid Ahmad Ludhianwi and Maulana Muhammad Shafi, rahimahumullah. So these are also very beneficial texts, and I've benefited from them. They are in Urdu. And I will continue, inshallah ta'ala, to keep writing and translating in English. But the point of this presentation, I mean, I haven't even scratched the surface. This presentation has gone on for very, very long, but I've barely scratched the surface when it comes to the evidence and the scholarly evidence. The purpose of this presentation was to introduce the issue and to understand the issue, that what exactly is at debate, and hopefully give you enough prerequisite linguistic knowledge so that you can read about it more yourself as well, inshallah. Okay, finally, I would like to conclude with some advice to both students and teachers. The first of which is very important. Do not corner your teachers. In fact, don't even confront your teachers. My blanket recommendation is to not even discuss this issue with your teachers. If you have a teacher of tajwid or qira'at and you're currently taking an ijazah from them, don't bring this up to them unless you are very confident about your adab of asking questions. There's an etiquette to asking questions to a teacher. If you're very confident in that, otherwise, what I've seen happen with a lot of students is that they take these opinions, they go to their teachers and they corner them and they confront them and they present it in such a way, and they don't mean to, but they present it in such a way as that they're forcing the teacher to respond, and the teacher might respond with some half-baked answer or be forced to defend that pronunciation without a good argument, and it becomes really sad. So a piece of advice that one of my teachers and my relatives gave me once is that when you ask a teacher or a scholar a question, give them some space, give them some room. Give them some room to be agnostic about the answer to that question, or give them some room to make mistakes, right? Don't corner them in such a way that, what do you say about this person who says that, Lad is correct and Lad is incorrect, and he's calling your pronunciation incorrect, right? I am not advocating, and nor do I do this, going around and telling people that their pronunciation is wrong. The point of this presentation and the point of making this evidence clear is for someone to be able to defend themselves and have the knowledge to defend themselves for their pronunciation when someone questions their pronunciation of Lad. That this is the resource to send to people, right? But I do not advocate confrontation. I do not advocate going to people and telling them they're wrong. My opinion, and with regards to the fiqh of this, is that if you pray behind someone who says dad wala dallin, your salah is valid, it counts. That is my opinion in fiqh according to the masail of Zallat al-Qari that I have studied and I have researched. So I do not think this is a fiqhi issue. I think this is just a matter of scholarly ikhtilaf now. Don't confront other reciters. So if, again, you pray behind someone, just to be content with it. Yes, Qari Ubaidullah al-Afghani and others have mentioned that the modern dad does nullify the salah. That is their opinion. I don't agree with that opinion. That is a fiqhi opinion that they've taken, because technically, if we consider the dad to be the correct pronunciation, then the dad would be lahn jali. The dad is lahn jali. But I do not take the opinion that lahn jali nullifies the salah just on its own. I take the opinion of Zallatul Qari from the Hanafi fuqaha, not the Qurra. Take your fiqh of tajweed from the fuqaha. That's my advice. Be open to differences of opinion in tajweed. Okay. This is both for students and teachers. There are many differences of opinion. There are many ikhtilafat in tajweed. Be open to those differences of opinion. Diversify your teachers, okay, so that you can see that people have differences of opinion, okay, and be willing to accept that others have the right to their opinions as well, right? Whether you believe them to be right or wrong as well. I don't expect to have convinced everybody. That wasn't even my main primary goal. My goal here was to transfer the knowledge of the scholars before me and my teachers, and just translate that into English for those who might not know Arabic or who might not know Urdu, and to just translate that so that people can defend themselves when they recite in this way. And my final advice, which I did not write here, but I would like to also stress that if you have a scholar, if you have a teacher of tajwid and you're currently pursuing an ijazah, and you currently have a teacher helping you with the recitation of the Qur'an, listen to your teacher and follow the pronunciation that they tell you to do so. And don't challenge them. You have time, complete your ijazah, you have time later to make up your own mind about certain things, but be respectful to your teacher and do whatever your teacher tells you to do while you're studying with them. Okay, and then you'll have plenty of time afterwards to make up your mind and and follow your own opinions. This concludes my presentation. I encourage everyone to continue reading more about this issue. I tried to keep it brief, but also comprehensive. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make this a means of benefit for myself and for others. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept this small efforts, and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to reward all of our teachers, the teachers that we agree with and that we follow, and the teachers that we might have disagreements with. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept all of their efforts in the effort of the preservation of the Qur'an and the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the khidmat of his deen. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from among the people of the Qur'an and the chosen ones. وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين وصلى الله تعالى وسلم على نبيه محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.